Hello, I'm Dave Feinleib, and this is Beyond the Shelf. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind e-commerce. Through conversations with innovators in the space, we learn the stories of these leaders and their strategies for e-commerce success. You can find out more about how we're helping leading brands build retail media, digital shelf, and sales enablement content more than 80% faster on average than their category competitors at itsrapid.ai. My guest on today's show is Danny Silverman. Danny is a partner in the digital commerce practice at the Partnering Group, a global strategy and management consulting firm. He is also the co-founder and chief taste tester at Mandylicious, his wife's baking and teaching business, which has more than 50,000 followers on Instagram. Prior to TPG, Danny was Senior Vice President and General Manager of Spotlight at Flywheel and Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at Edge by Essential. Before its acquisition by Essential, Danny was Vice President and CMO of Clavis Insight. And before Essential, Danny spent 8 years at Johnson & Johnson leading e-commerce development and shopper insights. We discussed Danny's experiences at Flywheel and Essential, his work at J&J, and his predictions for the next 12 months and beyond. Please enjoy my conversation with Danny Silverman. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excited to be talking with you today. Will you take us back? How did you get your start in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was at Johnson & Johnson, I did a rotation from brand marketing over into sales. And the first rotation was with what we called alternative channels. And at the time, the group had just taken a small cluster of retailers from telesales called .com. And it was made up of 1-800-diapers.com, Amazon.com, and drugstore.com. So obviously 1-800 became Quidsy, which was bought by Amazon. Drugstore was bought by Walgreens. Amazon is one of the original three that's, of course, still around. And we got a call one day and they said, hey, this is Amazon. We want to set up one of everything that J&J sells. And we're like, we thought you guys only sell books. We're like, yeah, well, we're expanding into consumables. And so, we made our number that quarter. So, selling one case of everything in the J&J price list.
What a great story.
Yeah, it was exciting. And from there, over the years, I moved up to the CVS team for about 3.5 years, but still stayed close to that team through it all. Worked a little bit on CVS.com. But who was the VP of the CVS team left to go start up an e-commerce focused team. So 3.5 years later, it's going to be pure e-commerce, and asked me to come and help him. And 6 weeks later, he left the company. So I ended up kind of building the first dedicated e-commerce P&L roadmap and plan for J&J. The centerpiece, of course, was Amazon. I was calling on Amazon at the time. And we also, opened up UK and France, as well as Drugstore was still our number 2 client at the time. Quidsy was still around in some form or another. So that was sort of my foray into e-commerce. And then we'll come back to that in a minute, I imagine. But there was a point at which J&J actually was going to pause their e-commerce investment at the end of around 2012. I kind of had gotten the e-commerce bug. I did not want to move back to one of the brick and mortar retailer teams. And from there, my career went in a different direction and I stayed focused on e-commerce ever since.
Did you always have a passion for the shopper and marketing and being in touch with the customer? Where did you get that knowledge and interest base?
So my very first job out of college was managing apartments. And I'll spare the story of how that came about. But after I finished school, I went and worked full-time first as a leasing manager and later as a property manager for around 400 units in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, primarily medical students at University of Michigan Medical School. And I was there for a number of years and eventually decided I wanted to go back to business school, originally to focus on real estate. The owner was going to work together and progress a career into real estate. And within the first few months of going through my core classes, I realized the part that I loved the most was actually the marketing aspect of it. It was the customer service aspect of it. We had taken a bit of a rundown property with a poor reputation, 70% occupancy to 100% occupancy and a waiting list. And that process of improving the tenant's experience And the marketing and sales aspect was actually what I really loved. And the real estate part, I didn't. And I made a quick pivot and said, marketing is what I want to do. And so I focused the rest of my MBA degree on marketing and strategy. And that led me to go work for J&J. I did my internship there and eventually got a full-time offer. And that was where I, really discovered my passion for the individual and for marketing as well. My undergraduate major had been in psychology. And I always say to anyone, one of the best investments you can make is to really understand psychology of humanity, basically. It helps you make a much better connection with people day to day in your personal relationships, but certainly in your business relationships as well.
Great insights and another great story. Tell us about J&J. A lot of our listeners are at brands as well as retailers. What are some of your big learnings from your time there?
It's interesting to look back because it's been so many years. I'm sure it's probably a little bit through rose-colored glasses, but a few of the things that come to mind, first and foremost, J&J always was and continues to be a highly collaborative culture. And learning how to get things done in that kind of environment was really helpful to me later in my career. There's a lot of management and decision making by consensus and building agreement. And so getting things done wasn't just about driving things through at any cost. It was about making sure that you understood what other stakeholders was important to them and what they thought were the priorities and getting them aligned or supportive. So managing through, frankly, a lot of politics, relationship management, relationship building. I also learned the power of concise communication. Earlier in my career, I was what I called a prolific emailer, lots of emails to all around the clock, very, very long emails. And over time learned that keep it above the fold, tight, concise, action, background, close, and taking that through not just to emails, but in your verbal spoken as well, can make a real difference in terms of being able to make an impact and making sure that people know what your point is and whether or not they agree with you. J&J was also, I think, like any CPG, like any manufacturer, heavy on data-based decision-making. Certainly cut my teeth on, Excel and learning how to really tear a data set apart and look for the insights and use data-based decision-making in everything that we're doing. And so I think that was another, important aspect that I took away from my time at J&J, at least on the, kind of nuts and bolts or tactical side of it. The other piece, of course, was brand marketing, brand management, and learning how to sell. Spent most of those 8 years actually calling on brick and mortar retailers. So I have that foundation, and I've found that to be invaluable even now, this many years into the e-commerce curve, if you will. There's still a huge amount of education to be done in so many organizations with people who really only know brick and mortar. So having that foundation of how to market and build a product, how to sell it into a retailer, and how to support it across the 4 Ps has been a wonderful foundation for my e-commerce career.
So after J&J, you joined Catapult eCommerce and then Clavis Insight. I'd love to hear about your experiences at both.
So I joined when Catapult eCommerce, when I joined, was originally called eTailing Solutions. And it was really one of the first of its kind. There were not very many, if any, dedicated e-commerce agencies yet. They started to really pop up and proliferate not long after Flywheel Digital, for example, came along right around the same time. And it was when things were really starting to explode and there was AMS and self-serve advertising was coming about and self-serve access that really gave birth to these kinds of solutions. One of the things that I worked on, for example, at eTailing was, as everyone knows, the data that comes out of Vendor Central or Seller Central is in Amazon's hierarchy. And any good brand is going to want to translate that to map to their own hierarchy. Well, in 2010, 11, 12, no one had that. That was not a tool that existed out there. And so I have over the course of my career, a track record of these unwieldy giant spreadsheets, but series of pivot tables on pivot tables, and created really our first ever view of here's what our business on Amazon looks like according to our hierarchy. And that was actually very popular with our clients at eTailing Solutions. We probably had 3, 4, 5, 6 clients who over the years we built that out for to help them really understand and analyze their business in their own terms. We also we had a bit of a broker service, so we were calling on retailers on their behalf. But the other thing that really would launch the next part of my career was we were doing, what would you call it, digital shelf audit. Now today you think about a digital shelf audit and you think of tools like Edge and Profitero and everything else. we were manually counting how many images on a page, how many feature bullets, how many characters in the description. There was no technology to do this. It was very manual. And we offered it once a quarter, and there was really no one else out there doing it. But as I got into it and we got more and more business, we needed to find a more scalable solution. Was it hiring interns? Was it offshoring? And I started thinking there must be something out there, some technology that can help with this. And it actually was more the challenge of figuring out what to search for, because digital shelf analytics wasn't a term yet, right? But one way or another, it took some time, but I eventually found Clavis Insight, and put an inquiry in through their website and said, hey, we're interested in your service. And I got a call from my would-be future boss who said, we see you as a competitor. And I'm like, well, we can change that. Let's meet. And we ended up striking a partnership with Clavis Insight. And lo and behold, I went to go work for them a few months later, originally as VP of consulting services, basically. So yeah, and that was an entire journey in of itself, very much in a startup phase. Originally started with consulting services, found that clients were less likely to spend extra money for consulting at that point when they were still trying to learn how to use this enterprise solution software. And so we paused for a moment, ramped up a client services team, and put client service capability or services around our subscriptions. That was then, part and parcel that then we could go and add the consulting piece on top of it for whatever was above and beyond what came with the subscription. And over the course of those years, I also spent some time on sales strategy, building executive relationships with our clients that were outside the normal day-to-day of renewals and upsells, and there's problems and all of that. So I was running customer advisory boards. I did an interim stint running product and actually learned up close and personal kind of how product teams work and how all that fun is structured. And then 2017, I got a call, I think it was New Year's Day or maybe January 2nd, asking if I would take over marketing. We were struggling. There was a competition had gotten really thick in the market. Certain competitors in the space who might not be named were giving us a run for our money. And,
I think I might know some of those.
You might.
Yeah.
And we're in our third year of funding and figuring out what was next. Let's tune up our messaging. Let's tune up our positioning in the market. So I took over eventually as CMO, ran the marketing team through to when we were acquired at the end of 2017. And, then we were acquired by Essential, and that was the start of the next phase.
Now, making this jump from the brand to some of these, at the time, smaller companies, what was that like? What gave you kind of the inspiration to go from what I'm sure could have led to very senior roles at J&J to take the leap to work with some of the startups?
So with all due respect to my former colleagues at J&J, it's many, many years gone now, so I'm sure it's very different. But I was increasingly, this is just part of my character, increasingly having trouble with the box, if you will, with sort of like, this is the way it is. I had a mentor who once referred to it as the monolith, right? It's such a big company. The monolith it doesn't judge. It doesn't have emotion. It's not personal. It just is the way it is. And that became increasingly almost claustrophobic as I was rising up in the ranks and started as a people manager and having people reporting to me and getting deeper and deeper into it. I was looking for somewhere to go where I could kind of have more flexibility and really express more of my entrepreneurial spirit and energy. And that was what led me to start looking to smaller companies.
What a great journey. So Clavis was acquired by Essential, and then Essential was acquired by Omnicom. You've seen the space really evolve over a number of years now. What have you seen? What's similar? What's different today, and how you see the space and how brands are working in it?
Yeah. At the end of the day, what continues to amaze me about this is the fundamentals are unchanged. Ideas that, we developed in 2010, 11, 12, and we're talking about how to transform how you think about the offline 4 Ps into the online, what eventually we would call the 6 Ps. The core fundamentals are unchanged. Like, if you want to understand how to win online, it's about availability, price, search, reviews, and content. It's changed a little bit. I've been referring to it lately as the E6Ps. So your product placement, your presentation on shelf, promotion, paid search, and media, and price. Media is probably the most dynamic shift. It was always there, but it's become such a much bigger piece of the whole puzzle. but those fundamentals are unchanged. And understanding those is critical. I like to look at it through a basic formula: traffic times conversion equals sales. Very common. A lot of people out there use that same formula. But in my mind, everything rolls up to those two things. But traffic and conversion are inextricably linked. It's not like one is media and one is retail. The two feed off each other. So you've got to have your content right in order to drive traffic and advertising. You can't drive advertising if you don't have your PDP right. It all comes back to those core fundamentals. So a lot of that hasn't changed. There's obviously a lot more data and science behind all of it than there ever was. Lots more platforms that help you truly understand what the data says, what to do, how to make decisions, and how to do it in a much more scientific way. So not just the proliferation or explosion of retailer media, but also even things, tools that help you optimize your content or your copy. There's a lot more sophistication on that front. But again, I come back to the fact that all of it continues to be better, more efficient, scientific, data-based ways to do the core fundamentals that are actually unchanged.
Now, I want to ask you more about the digital shelf, but before I do that, you've had these marketing roles quite extensively across multiple organizations. Do you have some insights or rules for the road for us on how to think about marketing more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I maybe I've become a bit of a marketing cynic over the years, but really my time as CMO at Clavis and later Edge really honed my thinking about marketing. I also always recommend Seth Godin is a phenomenal author to follow and read his daily blog, and it's absolutely influenced a lot of my thinking over the years.
For sure.
And given me a lot of inspiration for some of my career decisions. But one of the things that you just can't escape is marketing, I like to say, fills the gap between perfect product and the reality of your product. If your product was absolutely perfect with perfect market fit, you would not need to spend $1 or a minute on marketing because it would go viral through word of mouth because it's the perfect product. How much marketing you have to do and how much selling depends on how far you are from that perfection to the reality of your product. If you have a flawed product market fit, if your product isn't working, if it just doesn't match what the audience wants, no amount of marketing is going to solve that, right? But that said, there certainly is that gap. There always will be. The perfect product is always going to be elusive. And so marketing really comes down to understanding then who is your core demographic, who is your core buyer, shopper, consumer, customer, whatever it might be, what motivates them to buy, and then reverse engineering from there, what's the best way to translate for them how your product is going to make their life better. Another kind of core fundamental insight that I always think about too is when marketing or selling, considering the buyer and not necessarily they need it because they want to grow sale or they want to grow their brand or they want, they have a job to do. They themselves want to be, applauded by their superiors. They want to get promoted. They want to have career progression, and you could be the enabler to that. And so thinking about how does this solution set them up as the hero, and thinking about the risk they're taking on by recommending your product or solution is really important to the sales cycle and working with them and making sure that you're coming at that audience with a message and a proposition that makes sense, and also not coming at them with something that isn't going to meet what they're looking for, because that's of course a recipe for disaster.
Sometimes other entrepreneurs will ask me how we got into accounts like a Pepsi or Newell, and I'll say, well, that's the brand, and we're really lucky to be working with the brand. But we got in with a person who took a chance and took a risk to adopt a product, and hopefully we are then over-delivering for them. So it's great insight. Talking about marketing to shoppers now, how are you thinking about that? You're working at TPG, you do consulting, you work with a lot of different brands. What are you seeing some of these leading brands do when it comes to digital shelf and retail media?
There's a bit of a range of response to that, and it really depends on the priorities of the organization. By and large, as much as I'm an e-commerce evangelist and I've been passionate about this and 15, 20 years in this space, most manufacturers, if you're not a digital native brand, if you're not an e-commerce first brand, the majority of your sales are going through brick and mortar, and it's probably going through Walmart. So I have plenty of clients I've worked with who pay a lot of what I would call lip service to say it must be omni-channel, we must have e-commerce, we must have digital shelf. But what they're really thinking is most of my sales are going through brick and mortar, and that's what I really care about. But we've got to have this to check a box. And so what I think about is how do we make it as more of a box check and make them understand the importance that increasingly would-be shopper consumers, they are starting on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're on Google, and their product exposure is starting there. They may then go to an Amazon or direct consumer site. They might not be purchasing there, but it's absolutely influencing that offline purchase. And so that's really where I try to think and start these kinds of engagements or conversations. And what I see the most forward-leaning brands doing, they truly understand that e-commerce does not exist in a bubble. It's not a nice to have off to the side. It's integral. And whether that's because the brick and mortar retailer is expecting an investment or they want to see their online execution match what's happening in store, or whether it's a brand who truly understands that the consumer shopper is starting online before coming into store, that's where you're really going to have your recipe for success. And along those lines, the first thing I always want to know when I'm talking to a prospective client is how much sponsorship do they have of this initiative? How high does it go? If it's in the C-suite, we're in a good spot. If it's within the e-commerce team, then I know that you're talking to a team that could have all of the support they think in the world. But at the end of the day, if budgets come or they need more money for a brick and mortar initiative, often e-commerce is the first to get cut. It's just the reality. And so knowing that place and role helps figure out what's the best way to work with them and help make them successful. But to your question, the most successful brands are thinking about omni-channel holistically and understand that this is not a separate P&L that should be thought of completely different, but it is part of the greater whole.
So even if the purchase doesn't end up happening online, wherever that purchase happens, the shopper's getting exposed to content in all different channels and video and PDPs and wherever it is, it's important to invest in that, but it's important to understand that they might be making the purchase wherever that ultimately happens.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of retailers that are really experimenting and doing some really interesting, innovative executions in social media on TikTok. And it's not necessarily Amazon, right? It's some of the other scrappier grocery retailers who really understand how to drive social media, how to pick up on the trends and convert that into something that's relevant, that's going to drive a trip to the store. And they're doing it in creative ways that inspire, purchases. And so understanding that that's the place to grab them it's kind of a big idea. Especially relative to how fast that's happened for retailers and for, traditional brands. The digital native brands have known this forever, right? But the more legacy brands and retailers, it's really exciting to see how much they're doing to meet meet their potential shopper in that, that high up in the funnel and engage them and ultimately translate that into purchases.
So you're in the boardroom, you're advising, consulting with the C-suite, and they ask you, we've got all these competing interests. We could double down on retail media. We could work on our product detail pages. We could work on our in-store investments, our social media. How do you guide them on all those competing interests and investments that they could be making?
It often starts with what are the brand priorities? Is it top line? Is it bottom line? And like I said, is it brick and mortar or is it e-commerce? If, all that said, if it's a decision purely about the online space, I always say start with the fundamentals. I've had several clients I've worked with who are like, hey, I'm actually spending 40 to 50% of sales on media and business is declining. And I'm like, well, let's take a look at your PDPs. Your titles are a mess. Your images are outdated. Your content isn't optimized. Your variations are all over the place. So you're driving people to a terrible experience. So let's hold off on those budgets for a minute. Let's get our fundamentals fixed. And then we can start to invest media. And then from that standpoint, a key consideration is where the traffic is. There's a lot of questions around, well, how do I prioritize my retailers? And again, some of the omni-channel retailers are going to be prioritized based on what's married to what's happening in store and what the brick and mortar teams are trying to accomplish. But otherwise, you're almost always going to start with Amazon because that's where most of the traffic is. That's where the shopper is. And then you can kind of uh, allocate your resource and time out from there, depending on where the sales growth opportunity is and how you're trying to match up with the brick and mortar initiatives.
It's great. Well, we've covered a lot of great topics today. I'd love to hear about what you're thinking about for the next 12 months, what some of your predictions are for the next couple of months, couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So at TPG, we just shared our top 9 trends driving digital commerce in 2024, and I'm happy to share the PDF with anyone who reaches out. We've been sharing one trend at a time, once or twice a week, but we can certainly share the full PDF. But across those 9, there's probably 3 or 4 things that are very much top of mind for me. The first one is focus on profitability and ROI, and this is probably no surprise, but given what we've just been through, the hyperinflationary period and rising interest rates, all brands are very focused on profitability. I feel as a big part of that, there's been this very exuberant period of retail media and just a proliferation of platforms and every retailer rushing in because there's a huge amount of margin to capture through advertising, and a lot of it is deserved. But many, many brands now are stopping and saying, I need to understand what's the true ROI. Is this really, it's the classic question of where do I put my next dollar? Do I put it on this retailer's media platform, or do I put it into a display program in store? And so that focus on profitability is putting pressure on the entire ecosystem. That includes agencies who might have had an easier time post-COVID driving sales and are now finding that it's a much more competitive environment. Technology platforms that were, a fine investment earlier, but all of a sudden it's like, am I getting my return on this, on my full tech stack, or could I be doing it better? And ultimately, where am I going to find growth, going forward? So I think that's one, key prediction is that overall pressure on the ecosystem based on profitability, which will lead to a potential compression of how much money is going into retail media. Number 2, the rise of social native brands. Actually, this was our trend this week. Before joining TPG, the likes of Mr. Beast just wasn't on my radar. But now that my lens has shifted and I'm kind of back in the world of big brands and CPG and whatnot, it's very much front and center how many brands are now starting first in social media, led by social media influencers or creators, and then creating new threats or opportunities to legacy brands. So continuing to see that trend accelerate would be the second one. And then the third one is the continuing centralization of omnichannel. So post-COVID, with the huge explosion of e-commerce and it becoming such a bigger part of many brands' businesses, it's gone from being a team off to the side to being central to a company's growth. So they've brought that in-house. I think one other key consideration of that when I say omnichannel is also the direct consumer aspect of it. And I would just note that we're seeing the pendulum swinging away from direct consumer at the moment, with many brands assessing it was really good for us in the last 2 or 3 years, but sales have really slowed. Maybe we should refocus our efforts on Amazon and the other retailers and a little bit less on our direct consumer platform.
That's great. Well, Danny, it's been a pleasure. If you're up for it, I'd love to ask you a few rapid fire questions.
Sure.
All right, here we go. So these are tough ones. I warn you, hard to pick only 2, but what 2 people have inspired you the most in your professional life?
Sure. So it might be a little bit more unusual of a response, but there's a couple people I think of pivotal moments in my career and when my career changed as a result. One of them was actually the property owner of those apartments I had mentioned earlier, who's a wonderful individual, a philanthropist, very giving in certain areas, but he was an incredibly stingy business owner. And there was actually a lot that I learned about, how to be kind of frugal and careful, but also there was a lot of days where I said, someday when I'm managing my own business, this is not how I'm going to run it. And I actually learned as much about what I wouldn't do as what I would do from him. But obviously, he also supported my going back to business school and my entire pivot in my career and life trajectory. So I count him as one. The other one was a product director, my first product director at J&J. His name is Francisco Verwood. He tragically passed away in 2009 at a very young age. As my internship on the KY brand, he was the product director, Francisco Verward. He was also a very sort of firm manager, very direct, very specific in what he wanted. But he was also incredible with mentoring and coaching, and a lot of the fundamentals and foundations of what I learned about how to analyze and study and understand a business came from him, and really created the foundation of my 8-year career at J&J that followed. So I've always appreciated his hands-on approach to both being very, very clear and direct and firm in what he's looking for, but also taking the time to coach and mentor and help make sure that I understood how to get what he was looking for, so I could, kind of go on the journey with him and the brand and what was trying to be accomplished.
Those are great. So important. So hard to do well, also. Now, you've got family commitments, of course, but when you do get some downtime outside of work and family, what are your favorite hobbies?
My recent new hobby is I don't know if you want to call it bird watching or squirrel fighting. But about 1.5 years ago, one of my kids said, I'd love to have a bird feeder. And me being a techie, I said, I'll do one better. I'll put up a bird feeder, but I'll put a camera up too, so we can see them up close and personal. And my first iteration for about 1 year was next to a tree. And I have a whole YouTube channel actually of bird videos, but also squirrel videos and failed and successful squirrel attempts, which I'm happy to send you the link to.
No kidding.
I did eventually figure it out. I now have a squirrel-proof bird feeder, and I absolutely love, and I still have the camera set up and love kind of watching them up close and personal. It's pretty cool watching the birds throughout the year.
I love it. That's a great one. Now, if folks want to get in touch with you or find you online, what's the best way for them to reach you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you definitely can find me there. If you direct message me on LinkedIn, I'll definitely respond. You can also drop me an email, dsilverman@tpg-mail.com. And I can respond to you that way as well.
Well, Danny, it's been an absolute pleasure. So many great insights. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed today's show. Beyond the Shelf is brought to you by It's Rapid. It's Rapid is the platform Pepsi, Sierra Nevada, Revlon, and hundreds of other leading brands and retailers use to build personalized content at scale. Whether that's images, videos, or product descriptions for their product detail pages, shoppable videos or banners for their digital ad campaigns, or sell sheets for sales enablement, brands that use It's Rapid are able to produce high-quality, on-brand content on average more than 80% faster than category competitors. To find out more, please visit itsrapid.ai. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Beyond the Shelf.